There is a large body of information in the literature about the transformation of Japan from a feudal society to a modern, rapidly industrializing nation after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. There has been much written about the nature of the conflicts that came about as a result of the arrival in 1853 of Commodore Matthew Perry. And there have been many films, TV dramas, novels, manga, anime, and so on that are about this subject. This video seeks not to rehash the history books, but rather seeks to present a new perspective on this subject. There is a direct relationship between the modernization and rapid industrialization of Japan, following the change in government during the Meiji Restoration, and Japanese expansionism, which ultimately resulted in World War II and the Tokyo war crimes trials. Again, there is much that has been written on this subject, and so this video will focus on one aspect of this change only. That is the shift from a policy of Sakoku, or isolation, to a policy of expansionism. Why did this happen? This shift in policy is best explained if one thinks of the shift in governance not as one government replacing another, but rather as a shift in institutional precedence from the Tokugawa shogunate to the imperial court and the Choshu and Satsuma clans. This was a shift in institutional precedence because, while the shogunate had ultimate political power, the imperial court and the Han, or feudal clans, which were largely self-governing, were all part of a single governance structure, institutionally speaking. The theoretical approach that I am using in this analysis is called historical institutionalism, which seeks to explain policy change through a historical lens. Using this approach, this video will show that the time was ripe for a change in Japan. The shogunate was in decline, and the arrival of Matthew Perry, coupled with an idea, was the catalyst that set the wheels of change in motion. The idea was encapsulated in the slogan Sonnō Jōi, which translates as "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians." And this video will show that this idea was one of the driving forces behind the Meiji Restoration in 1868 and the subsequent policy of expansionism. Historical institutionalism is an approach that examines institutional and policy changes from a historical perspective. It seeks to explain how institutions and policies change and go into radical new directions after long periods of stability. In order to analyze policy change, there are two important concepts within historical institutionalism that need to be explained. Firstly, there is the idea of path dependency, which is simply the idea that when institutions create policies, these new policies become embedded into the institutional culture and become accepted as the way things are done. This idea becomes so ingrained in institutional thinking that changing policies becomes very hard to do, with a lot of institutional resistance. The effects are long periods of stability where policies do not change, or if they do, they change incrementally over time. This is called path dependency. The second aspect of this approach is the idea of the critical juncture. This refers to relatively short periods of time that can be described as, quote, crucial founding moments that send nations into wholly new directions of development. In other words, these are periods where an event happens that radically changes the status quo. During these periods, institutional resistance decreases and new institutions and policies emerge. Usually this occurs when there is another contingent factor present. In other words, we have a stable policy environment that changes as a result of a crucial event that is also contingent on a second factor. This video argues that in the change from Japanese seclusion to a policy of expansionism, this came about as a result of Perry's arrival, the critical juncture, and was contingent on a second factor, the idea of Sonnō Jōi. After a critical juncture, the new policy regime settles back into a new state of path dependency, where policies become ingrained in institutional thinking and are, as a result, difficult to change. Basically, in historical institutionalism, there are long periods of stable, path-dependent states, followed by a short critical juncture, followed by a new path-dependent state. Finally, in historical institutionalism, it is important to examine the role that ideas play. Ideas are potent because they can provide symbols and concepts that can persuade people into adopting a particular course of action. According to Jeremy Richardson of Nuffield College, Oxford, this is because ideas can have virus-like properties that can have the effect of locking people into a particular policy direction. This means that ideas can lead to a path-dependent state. Medieval Japan had been connected to the Chinese tributary trade system for centuries before the arrival of Europeans on the scene. The first Europeans to arrive were the Portuguese, who set up a trading relationship whereby they acted as a go-between in the trade of Japanese silver for Chinese silk. As part of this trade relationship, the Portuguese introduced into Japan various items including guns. With the Portuguese came Catholicism, which was introduced by the Jesuit priest Francis Xavier, and conversions to Catholicism started successfully with 750,000 converts by 1605, including 20 daimyos. This began to be a problem because the influence of Christianity was seen as a threat to the authority and legitimacy of the new Tokugawa shogunate, which as a result expelled 400 missionaries and severely persecuted Japanese Christians. This, however, was not the end of the matter, and 2 years after an agrarian uprising in 1637, foreigners were expelled and the Sakoku edicts were issued. However, despite what is commonly believed, not all foreigners were expelled, and the country was not completely isolated. Of the foreigners that were in Japan, only the Portuguese were expelled because they mixed religion with trade. The Dutch, who did not do this, were allowed to remain, albeit confined to Nagasaki Harbor. The intent was not actually to close the country. Initially, Japan wished to normalize relations with China. But this did not happen because that would have meant that Japan would have had to have placed itself into a tributary relationship with China. As a result, Chinese merchants were also confined to Nagasaki. Japan, however, did normalize relations with Korea, and so Japan and Korea had formal diplomatic ties, and Korea sent embassies to Japan every so often. Finally, Japan made contact with the Ryukyus, which is modern-day Okinawa, by forcing them into a tributary position in relation to Japan. So the idea that Japan was a closed country is not accurate. Rather, Japan maintained external relations with a select few nations, and on its own terms. With the exception of the Dutch, Sakoku was therefore the isolation of Japan from European involvement. Why? To some extent, Sakoku was about keeping foreign influences at bay. But the most important reason for seclusion was that Japan's Tokugawa shogunate was very interested in legitimizing itself, both in the eyes of northeastern Asia and internally. Controlling who could enter Japan was seen as one of the ways to do this, and over time, this was seen as a mark of good governance, and no one would have thought to change this as a result. Because Sakoku was seen as legitimizing the inability to keep foreigners out of Japan following the arrival of Matthew Perry in 1853, after 250 years of seclusion, was seen as delegitimizing. In other words, the shogunate lost its legitimacy, which meant that it could no longer govern effectively. When the Americans arrived in 1853, they found a country that was seemingly stable and peaceful after 250 years of isolation. The truth was that the shogunate was already in decline thanks to several factors, including the debasement of their currency, which resulted in inflation. The arrival of Perry threw the country into an uproar, which the shogunate was ill-equipped to handle. Sonno Joi movements sprang up in several domains, most notably and importantly Choshu and Satsuma, which ultimately led to the collapse of the Bakufu. Sonno Joi translates as, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," and the proponents of Sonno Joi, backed by Emperor Komei, called for the enforcement of the Sakoku edicts of 1635. Originally, Sonno Joi was not about calling for the end of the shogunate at all, but when the Bakufu's regent, Inosuke, signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce in 1858 with the United States, the powder keg of discontent that was lit when Perry arrived went off, resulting in a civil war. This video does not examine the events of this period, since there has been much written on the subject, and it would be beyond the scope of this presentation. But, as I said, the result was an alliance between Satsuma and Choshu domains, who, with the backing of the imperial court, removed the shogunate, restored the emperor to power, and formed the new government of Japan. What was Sonno Joi? Sonno Joi was a philosophical idea that stemmed from the Mito school, which emphasized the Confucian ideas of where one's place was within Japanese society, and preached absolute loyalty to one's superiors. It was an idea that legitimized the power of the shogunate originally, since he was appointed by the highest-ranking individual in Japan, the emperor. This changed after the arrival of Perry, and the emphasis shifted to the emperor as the rightful ruler of Japan. As a political idea, though, we need to turn our attention to one man. This man's name was Yoshida Shoin, and he is of critical importance because it was he who first radicalized Sonno Joi into a political idea. Yoshida Shoin was born in the village of Matsumoto in Hagatu province in Choshu in 1830 to a poor samurai family. By the time the Americans arrived, he was studying Rangaku, or Holland studies, and even went so far as to try and stow away on an American ship. He was caught and imprisoned, and then confined to his home, where he set up his own school. Yoshida Shoin, who had been educated in the Confucian values of the Mito school and in Rangaku, began to teach the need to firstly keep the foreigners away from Japan, as he saw them morally inferior and corrupting, since they did not follow Confucian ideas of hierarchy and loyalty, and to him, these were moral issues. Secondly, he also saw the need to adopt Western ideas, including science and military technology, because he saw this as the only way to defend Japan from the West. Coupled with this was that he saw as a crucial need to expand into Hokkaido, Kamchatka, the Ryukyus, Korea, and China, because it was the way to show the West that Japan too was a power to be reckoned with. To him, the defense of Japan was an act of loyalty, and therefore a moral act. This means that because he saw Japanese expansion as a means of self-defense, that Japanese expansion was a moral imperative. Not only is Shoin important due to his radicalization of Sonno Joi, He is important because his school produced many of the leaders of the Choshu Sonnō Jōi movement, who in turn became leaders in the new Meiji government. Shoin himself was executed in 1859, 9 years prior to the Restoration. But of the leaders of the Meiji government, his school produced 2 prime ministers, 4 cabinet members, 4 prefectural governors, and 12 diplomats, militaries of high rank, technical experts who had been given imperial honor or court rank. These 22 individuals represented 30.6% of his students who survived the Restoration. As a result, while there were differences in approach, these leaders were heavily influenced by his ideas of industrialization and expansion. He remained a nationalistic symbol right up until World War II, and so his influence could be said to extend that far, temporally speaking, and as such remains probably the most important figure in the collapse of the shogunate system. After the restoration of the Meiji Emperor and the formation of a new government centered mainly on those from Choshu and Satsuma who had fought to end the shogunate, Japan started on a course of rapid industrial and institutional change. Japan's industrialization began with the mechanization of the textile industry in order to bring in the capital needed to forge steel and to modernize the military. The new government, many of whom had been students of Yoshida Shoin, as I mentioned earlier, embarked on this course of action because, consistent with Shoin's teachings, they saw as the way to defend Japan from the Western powers the need to become a strong, modern nation. There was also the desire to not allow what happened in China following the Opium Wars to happen in Japan. Japan sent out envoys to Korea to inform them that the emperor had been restored to the throne. The Koreans rejected this because to them, based upon their tributary position in relation to China, the word emperor meant the Chinese emperor. And so they took the notice of the Japanese to mean that Japan was asserting itself as superior to Korea. In response to this rejection, Kido Takayoshi, also known as Katsura Kogoro, who had been a student of Yoshida Shoin's, advocated a punitive expedition. For a while, cooler heads prevailed, but Japan soon embarked on a course of gunboat diplomacy and precipitated a conflict where Japan imposed unequal treaties on Korea in 1875. This was the first expansionist move by the Meiji government into Asia. In 1894, there was an anti-foreigner uprising in Korea, which the Koreans couldn't deal with on their own, and so China agreed to help by sending troops. Japan immediately responded on the pretext of maintaining Korean independence, which made China the enemy, by sending in its own army. The resulting war with China ended with a Japanese victory in 1895, whereby it gained Korea and Taiwan as possessions, as well as a contempt for the Chinese. The sending of troops to Korea was framed as a defensive move, not just Korean defense as was stated publicly, but also the defense of Japanese interests in Asia. This continued in the case of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where Japan saw Russia as a threat. Japan was terrified of Russia, and so cultivated a peace treaty with the British. Japan was interested in placing a buffer between themselves and Russia, and so invaded northern China, on the pretext of defending China against the Russians. The defeat of Russia by Japan further emboldened them to follow a path of yellow imperialism in Asia to replace the white imperialism of the Europeans. The underlying motivation was a sense of the need to become like Western powers in order to best be able to defend themselves. The expansion into Asia that started in 1875 was seen as defensive in nature and was entirely consistent with Shoin's vision. It can't be said that the Meiji government in any way said to itself, "What would Shoin do?" But they were, based on the fact that the original members of the Meiji government were Shoin's students, heavily influenced by his ideas. As I mentioned earlier, Shoin remained a nationalist symbol up until World War II, which according to the defense summation at the Tokyo war crimes trials, was also fought as a defense of war. Now I have to be careful. I am not in any way arguing that Japan fought World War II for defensive purposes. What is important is that it is clear that the Japanese themselves saw it that way. In terms of historical institutionalism then, this video has shown that this approach is one that can be applied to the change in policy from one of seclusion to expansionism. This video has demonstrated that the Sakoku policy of seclusion became path-dependent. This is not difficult to demonstrate given the hierarchical nature of Japanese society at that time. Seclusion became part of the institutional culture because no one would have thought to A, change the policy that had been ordered by the shogunate, and B, because good governance was associated with keeping foreigners out of Japan, except for the Dutch, seclusion was about the legitimacy, the very legitimacy of the shogunate. In terms of the critical juncture, it can be seen from the evidence that the arrival of Perry in 1853 was a crucial moment in Japanese institutional history, and generally as well, because his arrival, coupled with the idea of Sonnō Jōi, radically altered Japan's direction in terms of policy. It is a little harder to show path dependence in terms of the expansionism of Japan, but I think it is clear that the motivating factor was the defense of Japan from Western powers, and that this idea of expansion as national defense was based on the ideas of Yoshida Shoin. I also base this on the fact that many of Shoin's students, who were heavily influenced by Shoin as a result, became members of the Sonno Joi movement and members of the new Meiji government. Finally, the fact that he remained a symbol of Japanese nationalism right up until the end of World War II shows that his influence, many years after his execution in 1859, that his influence was still felt. And so on this basis I conclude that his ideas, coupled with Perry's arrival, placed Japan into a new path-dependent state. This would therefore have had the effect of making the ultimate conflict with the West in World War II inevitable. It is important to note, though, that there are many, many more factors involved in the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, the restoration to power of the Meiji Emperor, and conflict with the West than was presented in this video. This video has examined only one aspect of these changes, and to go into much more detail would be beyond the scope of a 25-minute video. It is also very important to note that there is much more empirical research to do in this area, which will be part of a larger work that I will conduct. And so I advance this argument and conclusion as the following hypothesis. The change in policy from Japanese seclusion to expansionism can be explained to be a result of a critical juncture, radically changing institutional culture and policy from one path-dependent state to a new path-dependent state, with the inevitable conflict with the West in World War II as a result. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it.